Fiji, Pakistan, Kiribati. These are three of the countries in the top 10 of the Climate Risk Index for countries most at risk due to the effects of climate change. In this presentation, I will be demonstrating the impact New Zealand has on climate change and why the threat to human rights as a result of climate change places a responsibility on New Zealanders to participating in mitigating climate change. The UDHR stands for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the pillar for every person's basic human rights. The Declaration was proclaimed in 1948 by the United Nations General Assembly. The threats posed by the effects of climate change violate numerous articles of this declaration. World Vision New Zealand discusses climate change and its effects by stating, "Climate change is impacting all countries in the world. Evidence of climate change is seen in increased global average temperatures, rising sea levels, more intense storms, and melting ice sheets and glaciers. The way climate change will affect the most disadvantaged is through the drastic rise in flooding, heat stress, food insecurity, drought, and increased exposure to diseases in densely populated areas. The widespread poverty in such countries will be unable to prevent the inevitable negative effects of climate change." One of the countries most affected by climate change is Kiribati, as the rising sea levels lead to the island becoming dubbed a disappearing nation. However, the rising sea level sinking the country is not where the climate change issues end. They experience further health issues due to the sea levels contaminating the underground wells named boreholes, in which if the water is drunk causes illness which is easily spread due to the lack of health care as an impoverished country. Due to this, the effects of climate change and the citizens of Kiribati have their rights to Article 25 of the UDHR. Everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and of his family. This is arguably the most essential of basic human rights, being violated and putting Kiribati citizens at risk, all from the effects of climate change. In 2014, New Zealand contributed to 0.17% of the world's total greenhouse gas emissions. 0.17% does not sound like a lot when taken out of context, and is where many citizens may be led into a false belief of how New Zealanders are not responsible for mitigating climate change. However, per capita, New Zealand is a significant emitter, being placed the 21st highest contributor towards climate change in the world, while being ranked just 126th in terms of population size. The reason New Zealand is a high contributor is due to their large amounts of dairy farming sectors, in which cows produce methane, which is able to trap heat in the atmosphere, causing a rise in temperature. New Zealand is contributing to stripping away the most basic of human rights from people who already had very little to begin with. So now, countries like New Zealand are placed at a crossroads in which one of their greatest contributors to their economic wealth is also contributing to threatening the lives of many of the most vulnerable peoples in the world. This dilemma is easy to solve if we refer to the beliefs of the indigenous people of New Zealand, the Māori people. As is stated in the article, Climate Change and the Right to Health for Māori and Aotearoa, Māori understandings of health emphasize a holistic perspective that incorporates spiritual, intellectual, physical, social, and emotional dimensions, and includes relationships with the natural environment. Further expanding to state that the United Nations Development Group, in its Indigenous Guidelines section, states that a healthy Indigenous community is one in which the community as a whole enjoys harmonious relationships with its environment. This shows how climate change is not only discounting the human rights of those most vulnerable in a global context, but also those indigenous to New Zealand. As Māori citizens, their right to health is being violated, due to the damage done by dairy and manufacturing sectors to our environment, while also violating an Indigenous guideline of having the community being placed in a volatile situation in which the views of the people in Indigenous communities are being overlooked by those in power supporting dairy farming as it continues to bring in the money, rather than focusing on the human rights of the most vulnerable communities. To demonstrate this, there is a clip of former Prime Minister John Key appearing on talk show Hard Talk, discussing how he believes that New Zealand is 100% pure and backing its dairy sector, completely discrediting the effects on New Zealand and the rest of the world's most vulnerable communities.
If anybody goes down to New Zealand and looks at our environmental credentials and looks at New Zealand, then for the most part, I think in comparison with the rest of the world, we are 100% pure. In other words, our air quality is very high.
100%, 100% is 100%, and clearly you're not 100%. I mean,
this is what I believe makes climate change such an important issue for New Zealanders to mitigate. It has been overlooked and discredited within New Zealand, despite it being a massive human rights issue. The change of the effect we have on climate change begins with us common people having our voices heard. Being a first world country who has the facilities to protect the most vulnerable by mitigating our production of dairy farming sectors. Learning from the COVID-19 pandemic, if we can withstand the world shutting down to protect the most vulnerable global citizens, we can handle not intensifying our dairy farming to the point it's responsible for destroying our environment, violating human rights, and causing deaths of the most vulnerable peoples in our community.